The human eye sees the evidence every day, a crisis getting worse, not better. In America's wealthiest cities, Los Angeles, New York, Seattle, the number of unhoused people is skyrocketing. In 2024, the nation recorded its highest level of homelessness ever, with over 770,000 people sleeping in shelters or on the streets. But here is a paradox that should shock every citizen. Governments aren't ignoring this. They are spending billions of dollars. Targeted federal funding alone is over $10.3 billion annually. If the system is pumping unprecedented money into the problem, why is the problem not just persistent but expanding? This is a story of a policy failure, so profound it isn't just wasting taxpayer money. It is sacrificing human lives. The scale of the crisis versus the scale of the spending. The first step in understanding the paradox is recognizing the scale of the money involved. It is tempting to believe the system is underfunded, but the reality is more complicated. The federal government's targeted spending on homelessness assistance programs is now over $10.3 billion for the current fiscal year, a figure that is often dwarfed by state, county, and municipal budgets, which can easily push the total annual expenditure past $40 billion nationwide. Consider one critical, often hidden statistic: the cost of not housing someone. Studies from places like Santa Clara County, California, have estimated that a single chronically homeless individual can cost the public system up to $83,000 per year through emergency room visits, jail stays, and police interactions. Compare that to the estimated annual cost of supportive housing, which can be around $20,000 per person. The math is staggering. The country is spending 3 to 5 times more to manage the crisis than it would cost to solve it. This is a funding shortage. It's a profound misallocation, a system designed not for success, but for perpetual maintenance. The numbers tell a story of a rescue mission that somehow became an industry, an emergency relief effort that is calcified into a bureaucratic holding pattern. Housing first, the silver bullet that missed the target. The dominant policy framework in America's response to homelessness is called housing first. The philosophy is elegantly simple: provide safe, permanent housing to an individual with no prerequisites, no demands for sobriety, employment, or participation in treatment. The theory, backed by powerful early studies, was that a secure base would naturally lead to stability. And on its own terms, Housing First shows impressive results. Data confirms long-term housing retention rates for permanent supportive housing, PSH, can be as high as 88% to 98% for certain populations, such as veterans. But the paradox emerges when we look closer at the first part of the policy. The federal government, specifically HUD, shifted its funding priorities dramatically, moving away from transitional housing that required sobriety and service participation. Between 2007 and 2015, the U.S. saw a 30% reduction in chronic homelessness, but this success was followed by a collapse. The critique often ignored is that while PSH provides a home, the associated supportive services, the critical mental health and addiction treatment, were severely underfunded. In the early 2000s, nearly 60% of HUD funding was for supportive services. By the late 2010s, that figure had shrunk to around 30%. Housing First provides a shell of stability, but its implementation often lacks the necessary medical and therapeutic infrastructure to address the core trauma, addiction, and mental health issues that plague the chronically unhoused. The result is housing stability without genuine human recovery, a situation where the policy has achieved its statistical goal, but the moral and functional problem persists, creating a new, housed population still struggling with acute crises behind a closed apartment door. The policy maze, bureaucracy, funding silos, and the shell game. The biggest obstacle to effectiveness isn't malice or even a lack of money. It's the structure of the federal response itself, a tangled, labyrinthine bureaucracy that makes seamless help impossible. Funding for homelessness does not come from one simple source. It is scattered across nearly a dozen major federal agencies, including the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, and the Department of Veterans Affairs, VA. These funds are distributed through various grants, like Continuum of Care (COC) grants, which totaled over $3.7 billion in 2024. The The problem is that these programs operate in rigid, non-communicating silos. Money for housing is kept separate from money for mental health, which is separate from money for job training. A single homeless veteran with substance abuse issues might require funding from 3 different federal agencies, funneled through 2 state-level departments, and executed by 4 separate local nonprofits. If the documentation or eligibility window for one funding stream is missed, say, the VA housing voucher expires while waiting for the SAMHSA mental health intake, the entire process collapses, and the person ends up back on the street. This bureaucratic shell game ensures that every dollar spent is consumed by administrative overhead, documentation requirements, and turf wars between agencies, when estimated 30 to 40% of some funds never even reaching the intended service. The system is perfectly optimized to protect its own structure, not to deliver unified, effective care. The policy paradox: emergency relief versus systemic change. A critical function of the massive spending is that it is overwhelmingly focused on emergency relief rather than systemic change. Most of the billions are spent on what is known as triage, short-term shelters, temporary rental assistance, and food banks. The Emergency Food and Shelter Program, for example, receives hundreds of millions annually. While these services are humane and necessary, they treat the symptom, not the disease. The federal response is constantly in disaster mode, a mindset that is politically and emotionally satisfying but fiscally self-defeating. The fundamental, systemic disease is a lack of affordable housing supply, where the median rent has far outpaced wage growth for the working poor. In major U.S. cities, a worker must earn almost 3 times the minimum wage to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. Yet, of the billions spent, only a fraction is dedicated to generating new, deeply affordable housing units. The preference for perpetual emergency spending allows local governments to avoid the politically unpopular decisions required for systemic change, such as zoning reform to allow for higher density or massive, state-funded housing construction projects. By choosing the policy of rapid, temporary fixes, the U.S. has created an emergency industrial complex that maintains the problem while offering the illusion of activity. The hidden costs, beyond housing, the addiction and mental health drain. The failure of the Housing First model to prioritize compulsory services has created an invisible and exponentially rising hidden cost for society. The data is clear. The homeless population experiences a disproportionately higher prevalence of severe mental disorders and substance use issues. For instance, in one study, the mortality rate for unhoused adults aged 18 to 54 was found to be 3.5 times higher than the housed population. When treatment is optional, many individuals with severe mental illness or chronic addiction, precisely the population PSH targets, do not engage with services. This leads to a massive drain on high-cost public services. Unhoused individuals are frequent users of hospital emergency rooms, with one study showing cost savings of up to $29,400 per person per year when they transition into supportive housing that includes mandated care. The current policy, however, often leads to a cycle: a subsidized apartment, followed by a relapse, an overdose, an emergency room visit costing thousands, and a return to the subsidized apartment, all while the underlying health issue remains unaddressed. The paradox is that the policy, in its ethical attempt to preserve personal liberty, has inadvertently enabled a continuous loop of crisis that is both ruinously expensive and ultimately cruel. The path forward, disrupting the default, disrupting the policy paradox, requires a radical reevaluation that shifts from an emergency mindset to a structural solution. First, the political class must accept that homelessness is primarily a housing supply crisis, not just a poverty or addiction crisis. An immediate investment must be made in de-siloed, dedicated housing funds. This means moving away from a competitive, fragmented grant system and creating a single, streamlined mechanism that funds the construction of new, deeply affordable housing units, not just the subsidization of existing, inflated market rate rentals. Second, the effectiveness of the service component must be dramatically strengthened. While the core philosophy of housing first, that housing is a human right, should remain, the implementation must evolve to a model of housing first, service compulsory. Early data from programs that offer highly intensive, low barrier, but mandatory engagement with care services for the chronically unhoused show superior outcomes in long-term wellness and recovery, particularly among those with severe mental illness. This is not about punishment. It is about providing the life-saving medical care that a severe addiction or mental health crisis demands. Third, there must be a simplification of the funding maze. Consolidating the $10.3 billion in federal funding under a coordinated interagency structure rather than a fragmented Cox system would free up critical resources currently spent on administrative overhead and redirect them to frontline services and construction. A moral and fiscal reckoning. The policy paradox is the great shame of modern American governance, a crisis we pay billions to sustain. The money is there. The policy frameworks have been tested. The failure is in the execution, the fragmentation, and the political will to choose systemic, long-term change over politically expedient, temporary relief. We have built a system that is comfortable with failure because it has monetized the crisis. The ultimate moral and fiscal reckoning is this. We are no longer debating if we can afford to end homelessness, but if we are willing to stop paying the exorbitant price to prolong it. For too long, the cost of doing nothing has been rebranded as the cost of doing business. The data demands a shift. The citizens demand an answer. And the human being shivering under the bridge demands simply a home and the help necessary to keep it. The time for managing the crisis is over. The time for ending it with purpose and precision is now. The policy paradox of American homelessness is defined by a startling disconnect. Despite billions of dollars funneled into aid annually, the crisis continues to metastasize. This failure stems largely from a systemic misalignment where funding is disproportionately reactive, poured into high-cost emergency shelters and temporary stopgaps, rather than proactive measures like increasing the permanent affordable housing supply. While financial resources are abundant, they are often neutralized by restrictive zoning laws, bureaucratic fragmentation, and a failure to address the deep-seated root causes of wage stagnation and mental health care gaps. Ultimately, the current policy framework is designed to manage homelessness rather than cure it, rendering even massive financial injections insufficient against the tidal wave of structural inequality.